I do not believe that Judge Holden was the devil, nor a Gnostic archon, nor a trickster archetype. Judge Holden is above all telling the truth.
It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited. The ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be. That way and not some other way.
As I write this in May 2026, there are currently 4 ongoing genocides and 8 major wars unfolding, with around 40 minor conflicts on top of that. Hundreds of thousands of people have been killed this year alone. However, it's important to know this is not our most violent year. Since Blood Meridian was published in 1985, 14 wars have transpired, with 5 still actively being fought. Ukraine, Iraq, Congo to name a few. Then if we travel further down our limited history, the World Wars, Russia, America, among many others, and then and only then do we arrive at 1850 when Blood Meridian is set. It seems to me that it's abundantly clear that war is a part of human nature, some kind of unifying law that humanity cannot help but abide to. There is even evidence that prior to organised states, early humans engaged in proto-wars against one another through conflicts between bands. The late Stone Age archaeological site Nataruk in modern-day Kenya, discovered in 2012 by the University of Cambridge, shows evidence of a massacre perpetrated by one tribe against another, dating back to around 10,000 years before the judge would appear in Nacogdoches. Researchers found the remains of 27 people, 6 of whom were children, whose skulls were severely fractured from blunt force trauma, with one skeleton found with an arrow still embedded in the skull. There was even evidence of the binding of a heavily pregnant young woman. Jebel Sahaba, another Stone Age archaeological site dating back even earlier than Nataruk, showed us the remains of 64 people, all showing signs of death by organised violence.
His feet are light and nimble. He never sleeps. He says that he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite. He never sleeps, the judge. He is dancing, dancing. He says that he will never die.
If it is true that the judge never dies, then perhaps we can surmise he has been around for quite some time. Was he around to witness the massacres of Nataruk and Jebel Sahaba? Because his certainty that war is just as material, occurring, and inevitable as stone is a very strong foundation in our history as a species. It seems no matter how far back we go, the human cannot be separated from its violence, throwing Rousseau's notion of the noble savage down the tubes. This made me wonder just how far I could take this. I wanted to move away from the anthropocentric view of violence and move towards the animal kingdom, of course starting with our closest ancestors, the chimpanzee. I'm sure by now we all know how cruel these distant relatives can be, whether it's from modern media or the actual news.
Please hurry up! He's killing my girlfriend!
The chimpanzee has cemented itself in popular culture as a creature capable of exceptional violence. The logical assumption we can make from these stories of chimp attacks is to assume that they are just animals and therefore do not know any better, that it's simply in their nature. Well, when I say 4-year war, you're probably thinking of a conflict between 2 nations, but this is not the case. Between 1974 and 1978, primatologist Jane Goodall observed a war between 2 chimpanzee communities in Gombe National Park, Tanzania. The war resulted in the killing of all male chimps from one community and the consequent kidnapping of the losing community's females. What shocked Jane Goodall the most about this conflict wasn't the conflict itself, but the sheer brutality of the chimpanzee's actions. Although the conflict started off with territorial disputes between alpha males, a common source of aggression within chimpanzee communities, the chimp's eventual violence would far outweigh any sense of utilised skirmishing and quickly become depraved barbarism. In her 1990 memoir, Through a Window, My 30 Years with the Chimpanzees of Gombe, Goodall wrote, "Often when I woke in the night, horrific pictures sprang unbidden to my mind. Satan, one of the apes, cupping his hand below Sniff's chin to drink the blood that welled from a great wound on his face. Old Rudolph, usually so benign, standing upright to hurl a 4-pound rock at Godey's prostrate body. Jeromeo tearing a strip of skin from Dee's thigh. Figan, charging and hitting again and again the stricken, quivering body of Goliath, one of his childhood heroes. At one point during the conflict in 1975, Goodall even watched a high-ranking female chimp cannibalize a living infant. How far can we go down evolution with brutality? Wolves have been observed killing their pack's newborns to protect breeding rights. Male dolphins have been observed forcing themselves on their female counterparts. Many species of wasp inject their larvae into the bodies of other insects for them to eat their host from the inside out. There is even instances of brutality within the plant world. The kudzu plant, known as the vine that ate the south, operates by wrapping itself around other vegetation, taking all of the sunlight itself until its victim dies. Again, these instances are usually explained by simple survival tactics, and evolution doing its thing, and thus dismissed as non-moral and axiologically neutral. Non-human animals and plants, as much as it's not pleasant to hear about and observe, do this to perpetuate their own survival. But is that not what we're doing when we go to war? The admittedly intuitive answer to this is usually no. Wars and violence amongst humans are, through the ability to choose, avoidable. But is that completely true? We can go even further than living beings and look to physics to try and find an answer. The universe begins in an extraordinarily ordered low entropy state, unfolds into increasing complexity, persists through dynamic processes, and then trends towards thermodynamic dissolution. There is an aggressive direction, even at our most fundamental level, that dictates all within it to be born, to persist through dynamic process until its eventual dissolution. A universal law we must obey in order to exist, whatever violence that persistence may entail. It seems that Judge Holden wasn't just describing war, but describing the nature of the world itself. War was waiting for man, just as the wasp was waiting for the caterpillar, or the kudzu vine was waiting for the pine tree. This reminds me a lot of the metaphysics of Arthur Schopenhauer, a German philosopher from the 19th century, whose groundbreaking work, The World as Will and Representation, supposed that underneath all that we observe is one binding principle that he calls the will, and that all that we observe is merely just the will being represented phenomenologically. The will, as Schopenhauer explains, is a blind, irrational striving for life at all costs. No morality, no consideration, just desperate grappling for more life. The force drives all known things in our universe. It is infinite and never satisfied. The consequences of this metaphysics being true are manifestations of violence, competition, and discontent, with all living beings being led from desire to desire, never satisfied and always striving, no matter the moral cost. A universal law to all that exists. I believe that Judge Holden is this universal law, articulated and then deified. He educates himself not to experience a richer life, but instead for self-preservation and domination. He violates and murders anything he deems innocent, not for gratification, but to dispel moral idealism. He philosophizes not to understand, but to convince others to see the world for what it truly is, a cesspool of cosmic violence. But here lies the problem. If the judge is correct, then why do we recoil in disgust at his actions? Why do we, although read and perhaps get enchanted by his monologues, ultimately diagnose him as psychopathic, selfish, and evil? Because, as we briefly touched on, human consciousness complicates this law. There seems to be a fork in the road when a human arrives at this truth that the judge preaches. One can either affirm or deny. To understand this distinction in choice, we can look at two other characters from Blood Meridian, John Joel Glanton and the Kid. Glanton is perhaps the closest thing in Blood Meridian to a man who fully affirms Holden's diagnosis. He does not philosophize nor theologize, he simply acts. He becomes the material expression of Holden's metaphysics. Where Holden speaks of war as divine, Glanton acts accordingly. The world is violence, therefore become violence. The world dominates, therefore dominate. Existence is conflict, therefore cease pretending otherwise. The blind submission must be what Tobin designated as the dark covenant the two indulged in, a spiritual alliance with the law of reality, survival, conquest, force, hierarchy, domination. He abandons moral idealism in favour of total participation in the world as it presents itself. Glanton does not resist nature, he obeys it, and it destroys him. And once he is dead at the hand of the humors, Holden simply moves on without remorse, as his student has finally arrived at his inevitable graduation. Opposite Glanton stands the kid. The kid is not a saint. He murders, he steals, he participates in atrocity. Yet throughout the novel there remains something within him that Holden repeatedly identifies and despises. The kid never fully gives himself over to the judge, despite repeated attempts to absorb and convert him. Years later, when the kid, now the man, meets Holden again, the conflict has become metaphysical. Holden accuses him directly. He tells him that he was always a disappointment, that he withheld himself. He tries once more to convert the kid, or shall I say, the man, but the man refuses once again. And in what my opinion is an admission of defeat from the judge, Holden brutally sodomizes and murders the man in a toilet. The judge was defeated because he could not completely conquer the humanity in the kid, and so could only eradicate him, as if he was akin to a piece of Toledo armor crumpled and thrown into the fire earlier on in the novel. Human consciousness presents a strange contradiction to the judge, and dare I say threatens him. We alone seem capable of understanding reality while acting against it. The wolf does not choose mercy over hunger. The parasite does not spare its host. The vine does not cease strangling another plant because it has complicated ethics. Yet human beings routinely betray their own apparent laws. During World War II, Czech pianist Gideon Klein spent years performing in his home under the pseudonym Karel Vranek to avoid persecution from the Nazis. This lasted for some years until he was eventually caught and deported to a concentration camp in 1941. Whilst a prisoner at the camp, Klein spent his time, between grueling labour, holding concerts in secret, participating in chamber music performances, and writing his own string quartet, a string trio, a piano sonata, among others. Klein not only continued his work, but he also fell in love whilst at the camp with a woman named Irma Semica, to whom he trusted with all of his manuscripts. In October 1944, Klein was moved to Auschwitz, and then to Fürstengruppe, where he was murdered at the age of 25, less than 4 months before the camp was liberated. Irma survived the camps, and subsequently so did all of his work, which is available to listen to today. This example of compassion and creation and love in one of the darkest corners of humanity's history is just one of a multitude of instances in which humanity has gone against utility and domination. Art is irrational, compassion is irrational, love is irrational, and yet they exist. They seem to exist as a form of sovereignty, a violation of natural law to prove that humans can indeed be themselves, be free agents. On January 13th, 1982, Air Florida Flight 90 crashed into an iced over river. Rescue helicopters arrived at the scene, but could only carry certain amounts of passengers at one time. Rope from the helicopter was handed to a man named Arland Williams Jr. 3 different times, but each time he would pass the rope to another passenger. When a helicopter eventually returned for Williams, the rescue team would have to recover his drowned body. On the morning of April 16, 2007, during the Virginia Tech shooting, Romanian Israeli professor and Holocaust survivor Liviu Librescu would realise that his classroom's door could not be locked from the inside, and despite hearing gunshots from mere meters away, would run over to the door and physically block it shut, allowing enough time for all of his students, all 22 of them, to escape from the classroom's window. Librescu couldn't hold the door for long, however, and was eventually shot and killed by the perpetrator. I know these small acts are nothing compared to what we've seen occur throughout human history. Despite the hope they signal, they are still dwarfed by humanity's atrocities, and to champion them above said atrocities would perhaps be a form of foolish optimism. However, despite them being a minority, they are still a minority constant that quietly exists alongside immense pain and suffering. That much is evident. Holden is correct that violence permeates existence. History supports him, biology supports him, evolution supports him, perhaps even metaphysics supports him. Life does indeed seem founded upon conflict between competing wills, but there is another fact equally undeniable. Human beings repeatedly betray this order. Sometimes we choose against interest, against utility, against survival, against nature itself. We create beauty in a universe trending towards entropy. We preserve weakness where nature would discard it. We sacrifice ourselves for abstractions, but one mustn't see this as ignorance. It is, as I have said, sovereignty. A part of nature, separate from itself, that only humanity can choose to inhabit, even for just a moment. Because the highest expression of humanity is not to deny Holden, or to defeat him, or to prove him wrong, but to look him dead in the eyes, accept every truth he speaks, and then having the courage to be wrong.